Hello, hello. Oh, hi. Hi, everyone. Students, wave. Thank you so much for coming. And they came for the conference, not for me, but because they already read this in the book. I'm so excited to be here with Mark. Mark and I did not know each other before I read his story, A Death in Alabama. Real quick, I grew up in Calabama and I spent most of my life in Alabama. And when I read stories where someone who ain't from around here comes in and tries to tell us how to do things, I get a little bit upset. And so when I saw, who reads Sunday Long Read? Does anyone read Sunday Long Read? So if you don't, and you're feature writers, you should look it up. It is a curated menu of the week's best long form storytelling. And it's magazine and newspaper. And I like it because it comes out on Sunday on a slow day and I can scan it and see who's writing what. And usually I dive into a couple pieces. I recommend always clicking on the three dots where you get the below the fold recommendations, because that is where I found A Death in Alabama. And I don't always read that. And I dove in, but before I did, I was prepared. I was bracing to be really pissed off. I was actually bracing to kind of hate this guy, because so often I'm used to, Rick Bragg is one of my mentors, and I have a Rick Braggian chip on my shoulder about how other people come into Alabama with self-fulfilling assumptions. And often writers like Paul Thoreau, who wrote Deep South, come in looking for the Southern Gothic thing, but then they miss the other nuanced parts of Alabama. And I get a little upset about it. By the time I finished this story, I was crying. I think I immediately, it's not a short story, it's 11,000 words, but it read like much shorter. And I think I went back to the beginning and read it again, because I was like, how did he do that? He got the complexity and subtle nuances of small town Alabama culture, and having grown up on a catfish pond in a small Alabama town, that is really hard to do. So immediately I was like, who is this guy? And I'm like, oh, he's kind of a big deal. I'm like, who do I know who knows him? I want to ask him about this from Neiman's Storyboard. And Tom Juneau is a friend in common. And I was like, Tom, can you introduce me to him? Because I really want to know how he did this. So I reached out and said, would you do an annotation? And turns out I was going to New York. We met in New York and talked for 2 hours. And by the end of it, we were both wiping away tears, and we were so passionate about storytelling and what it can do to bring people together and bridge divides and be an empathy machine. So sorry about that long preamble, but I want to recreate kind of that conversation. And it really started with, oh my gosh, so how did you come as a New Yorker to this small Alabama town where they have circled the wagons? They are upset because one of their own has been hurt, who has killed himself because someone who calls himself a journalist did that. And how do you not only, get them to trust you, but be worthy of that trust?
That's hi. It's the most difficult part of this, I think, and you all know this if you love feature writing or do feature writing, is that we often encounter people at the lowest point of their lives, and we ask them to allow us to immerse ourselves in the greatest pain of their lives. And under the best of circumstances, when it's not such a story of loss and pain, trust is really necessary to the enterprise. And so when I encountered this town, which was remarkable, because Bubba Copeland took his own life right about 2 years ago. It was November 3rd, 2023. And I'm from a small town in the South myself. I'm from Southeast Texas. All my parents' families are from Southern Louisiana and Southern Mississippi. Not that that's necessary to write a story like this. I think anyone can write anything, any story, regardless of where they're from, as long as they care and are passionate and do the work. But it didn't hurt in my approach to these folks. My first approach was, there was very little journalism done about this story because the town had shut tight as a drum. They were resolved to not talk about this because someone who had called himself a journalist had done this to them. This had been a pain inflicted and irretrievable pain, irretrievable wound, a loss. that they could never recover. And it was done by someone who called himself a journalist. And so they were resolved to never speak to journalists about this again. As a consequence, their grief was sort of like a noxious cloud in an enclosed space. There was nowhere for it to go. And also as a consequence, the official narrative of what had happened to their friend was owned by the malefactors who had defamed him to death. And yet they had no interest in talking, zero interest. He was eulogized by 4 people from his church, including his son, Carter Copeland. And I had reached out to all of the eulogists because I was so taken by the bellow of grief and love. They were not circumspect in their feelings about him, which was interesting to me because I came from a small town and I could imagine someone having feelings of grief and love for someone if this had happened in my town. But I would imagine that they would be more circumspect. But these people were very open, very angry in their vexation and pain. And I wanted to understand that. So I wrote to them all, and none of them answered me. And so I gave it a few days, and then I wrote again to Carter Copeland, his son. And this time I wrote him a Facebook message. Facebook is good for something. And he answered me immediately. And he said, "Mr. Warren, I've gotten 500 such notes, but the Lord has put something on my heart to talk to you. Everyone in this town, in these towns, talks like this. The Bible I would come to learn, even though I'm from a small town in the South, I'm used to this. I grew up with these people, but I'd been away for a while. I'd been in New York for half my life. And so I kind of had to reacclimate a bit to this. And he said, all the inquiries he had gotten were, I'm here till tomorrow morning. My deadline's at 5. There was something inhuman about this. And we're in a time of purposeful dehumanization. That's what happened to their friend. And it's our job. It's always been our job to humanize, to rehumanize in this case. And so there was something about my inquiry, my approach to him, that he decided to take the risk to talk to me. We began to write back and forth, and we began to talk warily for a few weeks. And finally, I told him what I intended to do, what I would like to do. I wanted to establish the truth of what had happened. I wanted to reclaim the narrative of this story in its fullness. And he said, "I think I can help you with that." So I said, "Okay, I'm going to travel down, and I would like your help in finding other sources for the story." Interrupt me. I'm going to filibuster, please.
Can you?
Oh, I did.
Yeah, so that way I can interrupt. No. So you land and he has agreed to talk to you and you land in Alabama. And then a couple days go by and you don't hear from him. Can you talk about that?
Yeah. I get to Phoenix City, Alabama. I wanted to stay in the town where Baba had been the pastor of the First Baptist Church. And I get there and I text him when I arrive, and I hear nothing. The next morning, I hear nothing. I text, I call, nothing. And I'm just like, oh my God, I've been ghosted. I wouldn't blame him. And in fact, when he finally wrote to me, he said, "I'm so sorry. I'm going through it. This is hard, but of course I'll see you." And that's how. Then I drove and met him in Auburn, where he lives, and 4 hours he's weeping the entire time as we're having an ever deepening conversation in which I'm asking him to relive the most profound pain of his life, a shattering experience after which nothing will ever be the same. But he was determined to tell me the truth from his perspective, because he believed that a story could redeem his father. That was his interest. That was his agenda. It's not my agenda, but that was his purpose in this. And within an hour of our first interview, he had told me of their pact to no suicides pact. They would live, both of them. If I can get through this, you can get through this. No, go ahead.
And I was going to say, if you haven't read the story, the son, Carter, came out in high school and had a conversation with his dad, I think not knowing about his dad, right?
Correct.
And so they made that pact.
Yeah. So it's just not every story is like this. Not every story requires this sort of careful approach. But I will say that I've never felt so humbled in my life to be doing what we do, as in these precincts, dealing with these people's lives and feelings. These are real people. These are their lives. This is not a story to them. They've never had journalists intrude in their lives. They've never been in a situation that required a journalist to come calling. So this is all very new to them, and they are necessarily mistrustful, understandably mistrustful.
And can you talk about one of the other characters in the story actively vetted you with something like anger?
Yeah.
And can you talk about that and how you responded to that anger?
Yeah. There was a gentleman by the name of David White. He was a retired doctor, one of the premier nephrologists in the state of Alabama, a very good doctor, chairman of the board of trustees of the First Baptist Church of Phoenix City. Bubba was beloved to him. They were brothers. And so I show up in town. Bubba's son has begun to ask people if they might talk to me, and he's dead set opposed to it. And in fact, the rest of the town, the rest of the church had deputized him to vet me. And because if he says no, they say no. So Carter had called him and asked him to talk to me. Carter's giving me an unauthorized tour of the church. And when he gets the call back from Dr. White, and Carter's phone was set on, the volume was set so loud that I could hear both sides of the conversation. And he said, "Son, please don't do this. Please don't do this. You know it can only make things worse. It will stir up things again. Just as things are settling, it'll deepen the wound. Please don't do this." And Carter persisted. And finally he said, "Okay, have you checked him out?" And I said, "Yes, sir, with a fine-tooth comb. That's why I would very much appreciate if you'd spend some time with him." So he calls me at my hotel that night and just interrogated me sternly. Very rudeness to the point of anger. Like, what are you doing? You have no idea what you're facing here. The people you're here to meet are hurting. We are angry. We have a sense of failure at letting our friend go. And why are you here? And they had been so resolute and so successful to that point in not in resisting overtures or not talking, that they thought that I guess that they had gotten through it. But he said, "Well, if you like coffee, come on over. I'll look at you and see if I can trust you." And spent 5 hours with him that day and answered all of his questions. And as forthrightly as I could, when we're doing this, you can only describe to sources and subjects so much. You can only describe so well what you intend to do. Ultimately, you just have to kind of show them, I think. And so by the end of our time there, he had given the green light to the town, and they decided to talk to me because he in his framing, as we were talking, he realized, well, you're here. You seem to be insistent on doing this. If we're talking to you, it's because we don't want 1819 News, the website that had done this, to be the last word on our friends.
You said something when we were talking yesterday to a class, and it's so hard to make that first ask. I want to do a story about the worst thing that's ever happened to you, right? But you said something and you said, I really need to understand this. And I think that's a really important thing is it's curiosity. I need to understand this, not I need to get this story.
Yeah, I mean, it felt different to me. I mean, I felt like I knew these people. I'd never set foot in these towns, but I'd grown up in a town just like them. And their unabashed love and in their grief, they were so their expressions were so beautiful and what this man had meant to them. And I wanted to understand that, and I wanted to understand what he'd left behind. I wanted to understand the world that he had kind of created. He was the people who did these stories carelessly didn't, if they had done a simple Google search, they probably could have figured out that he was kind of the heart and soul of these towns. But they didn't, because they had a scoop. And they had kind of malign intent. They had gotten a malign tip. And they didn't really bother to figure out sort of the context for all this, or to figure out that he's not just a political target in a culture war, that he's a human being to these people. That's really lost these days. It's really lost, especially with, not to denigrate online journalism, but or online culture, but it's really easy to hurl rocks at targets that you're never going to see.
So one of my favorite questions that I asked you was sort of, and this is not being cheeky, but do you believe in God and do you believe in nut grafts?
I believe in nut grafts. No, I'm a lousy believer. I think I told you. How dare you put me on the spot like that? But I do. I mean, I think that. I mean, I do think that the show "Don't Tell" admonition really holds most often, but I think that you have to narrate. You have to shape the story and announce kind of what the guiding intelligence of the story is. You've earned the right from proximity and from immersion in a story to decide what it is you've come to tell out of all the things you've witnessed and all the things you've heard, um, all the things you've experienced. You've earned the right to decide what story you've come to tell. So you've got to shape it. You've got to kind of announce it in that way, lightly. I mean, sort of the interstitial sort of narration that we've talked about, I think is very, very important. You've got to bind and propel the story. Maria was talking this morning about momentum and how vital that is. By the way, can I just say, with all the presentations this morning, I have the biggest case of imposter syndrome I've ever had in my entire life. What the hell am I doing here? But anyway,
The thing,
yeah.
the prize, the thing.
Oh, right. Yeah. Okay. Sorry. But you've earned the right to do this. You're the guiding intelligence. That's what writing a story is. You feel like you have a story to tell. And the kind of the narration that binds and propels a story should never be a syllable longer than it needs to be. If it's ever mistakable for an essay or an op-ed, you're doing it wrong. You've gone too far. It's in the service of the story. Anyway, I'm just kind of extemporizing here.
Well, that's one of the elements that really struck me about the story. I'm always reading stories is what can I learn from this? How can I get better? And one of the things that I struggle with is I've worked so hard for most of my career to write in scene and to never break scene, stay in the narrative, that I often miss what I call the smart layer, which is what I noticed in this story is so present is you're not afraid to come out and with confidence tell the reader, this is what this means in really beautiful language. Like when I think of that, the insight or the analysis, it's the thing that you would highlight in the story. That's not seen, but that says this is what it means. And I'm working on having the confidence to do that. How did you develop that?
Oh, well, I mean, getting your hands on manuscripts over an extended period of time helps. Figuring out what works and what doesn't work. figure out what's essential and what's not essential. Again, what you were saying before, earlier, that to be ruthless with yourself and to when it comes to editing yourself. But I mean, I do think also in a story like Bubba Copeland's story, it was a local story. It was a terrible local tragedy that inflicted unending harm on these people that they will never recover from. They have dedicated their lives to living by his example. But it's not just an Alabama story. It's a larger story, and it's a small story in a large context. And so I think that what you call the smart layer, I think, is just sort of connecting the story to the world, connecting it to the sky. I mean, I very presumptuously, and I never would say this out loud because I don't want to sound like an asshole, but when I was working as an editor at Esquire, every time out, I would admonish writers to, whatever the prism that you're looking through, whatever portal, whatever set and setting, whatever characters you're writing, whatever happens in your story, you're trying to tell the story of the world. You're trying to connect it to something larger because there's a larger human experience. It's what binds us all. We all look for ourselves in these stories. Telling stories about ourselves to each other is what culture is. So if we can, especially in this instance, in which we've come to do, we've come to build community, but we've also come to do harm to each other using technology of astonishing power. And that's much bigger than an Alabama story,
Mm-hmm. One thing you did in this story that also struck me that could have gone wrong in all sorts of ways. And the reason I asked you if you were a believer is because you used scripture and you did it really well. You did it in a way that I didn't grow up going to church either. And so I can only speak for how I read it, but it didn't come across as cloying or pandering. It seemed really like it really needed to be there. Why did you do that? And how did you go about doing that so it didn't feel wrong?
I didn't set out to, oh gosh, I'm going to use the Bible in this story. I'm going to quote liberally from the Bible. Not at all. But the thing I said to you before about, I grew up in these towns, I grew up with these people, but I'd been gone for some time. So when I get to Phoenix City, and I'm suddenly aware after a few days of being kind of in this saturation of Bible culture, in which the Bible is not a relic. It is a well-worn daily instruction manual. And one of the things that I think you earn the right to do from kind of deep reporting and earning trust and being faithful to the experience of a story is I wanted to emulate the way they spoke. I mean, this was not a gimmick for a narrative. This is the way they talk. This is the way they express themselves regularly, daily. And it just so happened that that Bubba's last utterances from the pulpit were the psalm that finds him in the shadow of the valley of death. And as I was writing that section, juxtaposing his last Bible study with being kind of dragged into a very angry Board of Trustees meeting just after, it's the day the story broke. Wondering what the hell's going on, Bubba. To juxtapose those things and to kind of toggle back and forth between them and appreciate the tension of that. I just started writing, and I had the psalm right in front of me, and I had my notes from the angry meeting. And it just seemed to me that you could kind of increase the dynamism of that story by juxtaposing those two, by interweaving them and juxtaposing them against each other. And I just began to write.
You had a great detail in the story about how he sometimes forgot the words to the Lord's Prayer.
Yeah.
And so he kept a laminated copy of it on the pulpit. How did you get that detail?
Um, I got that detail from the old caretaker of the church in my unauthorized tour of the church. It was before they had vetted me and approved my access to the church. It was like, what the hell is this guy doing in church? And I was at the pulpit and I saw the Lord's Prayer there in a laminate. I said, Mr. Kennedy, what's this for? And he says, oh, yeah, Bubba would forget the words sometime. And
It's a pretty
so
good accent.
I thank I took a picture of it. I take a lot of pictures. I mean, like Eli, they not for publication, but just to spur memory and scene. So
I want to say, like, I talk in my class about details and telling details, and a telling detail is one that does more than just, decorate the scene. It's one that develops character, conveys meaning, and foreshadows. And I think that's a great example of a telling detail. Can you talk about your reporting? You had 8 days on the ground in Alabama, and then you did follow up phone calls remotely. But how do you go about getting to know and bring to life on the page someone who isn't around to meet?
yeah, that's a very good question, and it's a constant in our business, I think. I intended to go back and was going to go back, but by the time I left there in the first place, I had a satchel full of reporting. I had gained the trust of people who would talk to me and who could facilitate other people talking to me. So by the time I got home, after 3 weeks back home, I was doing 4 or 5 interviews a day with deepening my experience with the people, the sources that I had already developed when I was there, but also talking to new people that I had heard of either in the news or from talking to other sources that were key. And so the reporting was deepening. I mean, I became kind of acutely aware, Kim, that by after a couple of weeks, that this was sort of a group therapy for these towns. And I had people calling, asking to talk to me, saying that they wanted to talk about Bubba Copeland, or that they, um, had to get something off their chest. They had regret about whatever. It was a remarkable thing to happen. I was having to narrow what the story I was telling was, obviously. So I resolved to just talk to people who were in a position to tell me what had happened. And a lot of them were just obviously intimates of his. And but I think I told you yesterday that I had begun to write the story, and I was about a third of the way into the story before I even talked to one of the main sources of the story, which is the woman called Lisa Deason, who had tried to physically restrain Bubba from leaving that day and had to try to save his life in a physical encounter. I had text messages that she had sent contemporaneously to a couple of people that were harrowing. And I thought, well, I'll try to get permission to use those. But then I kept pressing to talk to her, and I was so glad that I did, because it's one of the fulfillments of the story. It's central to the ending of the story. It's a terrible scene. I don't know how I don't know how she I don't know how she's okay after that experience. But I'm so grateful to her. She alone among the people I talked to was pissed off. She was just angry, and she was speaking because she was angry. She was angry at Bubba for doing this. She was angry. She reserved most of her anger for the people who had done this to him, for the people, some in town, who had turned on him in those 2 days before he took his own life. And unlike unlike almost everybody I talked to when I'm jumping ahead here, but at the end of my reporting, I began to ask the kind of the core sources of the story, if they could, what would they say to the people at 1819 News? And I was struck dumb by an almost identical response from several of them, when they would say that we are required to love them and we'll be praying for them. when I told Lisa Deason that, she said, and pardon my language, she said, fuck that. I'm not praying for anybody. I want only bad things for those people. She alone was not going to get over this and was going to hold on to her anger.
That was one of the nuanced complexities that I thought you captured really well. And also the fact that the members of his Bubba's congregation might not have agreed with or even pretended to understand what he was doing in cross-dressing, but they loved him anyway and genuinely, not because the Bible told him to, and they tried to save him. When I saw this picture, I immediately knew there's probably a deep editorial discussion that went on about what picture of him to use and whether to use one and how big it should run. So can you talk about that?
I'd rather not. I'm joking. It was hard. It makes me nauseous looking at it, the picture. It was a really hard decision. We ended up using a picture because a visual reference is important for readers, especially if you're coming to a story cold and don't know the backstory, don't know what happened. And so we decided ultimately, after a week or 10 days of just Talmudic discussion and kind of torturing ourselves about it and deciding something and reversing ourselves and then reversing ourselves again, we decided that it was kind of important to have a visual so that the reader would kind of know what the hell we're talking about. Our purposes in using the visual were very different from the purposes of 1819 News. Theirs were really salacious and mocking. Ours were reluctance and just as visual information. And I said, it's going to be small and it's going to be fully clothed. And then I'm going to, go throw up. It was really hard. It was a very difficult decision to make. But ultimately, I think that you have to serve the reader. And you can control what you mean by something. If you mean to be salacious, it's going to look salacious. If you don't, then we can control what's on page. You're the God of this universe. Not a syllable gets uttered without your say so. And that includes the visual information too. So.
Did you prepare Carter in advance of it running that there was going to be a photo? Did you have to have a conversation or did you hear from them afterwards?
No, kind of like what Eli was saying earlier today, these people had been surprised enough. I didn't want to surprise them anymore. There's no cause to do that. These are people's lives. And so, yeah, there are bright lines, there are rules, and they're for a very good reason. But not when you're approaching people in deep grief who have no real agenda other than to salvage their friend's story. So that's a long overture to say, yeah, I informed Carter that we were going to use one of the images.
What did he say?
He understood. He was very kind and understanding. He also understood that we needed to take a full walk around his father. He understood that their agenda wasn't my agenda. They had things that they wanted to accomplish by doing this. They're different from mine. I wanted to find out the truth of what had happened. I think I mentioned to you yesterday, I had a lot of just incredible testimonials about what this man meant to his friends and to the world down there. And I had to be very judicious in what I decided to use because I wasn't writing a piece of advocacy for Bubba Copeland. I wasn't arguing his position. I was telling the story of what had happened down there. So you have to be very calibrated and modulated, I think, and kind of balancing what you do and careful that you don't tip over into some sort of strange piece of advocacy. It could be interpreted, I think, as that, because this is kind of a corrective of a narrative that had been established down there. I have no problem with that. But if it was understood as me going down there to write a piece of hagiography, about Bubba Copeland, then I would have done it wrong. I think then I'm doing something wrong. Make sense?
It does. Um, you mentioned that when you heard the response to what would you have to say to the journalists from 1819, you knew that was the ending. How did you know how to begin the story, and did anything change in the editing?
Editors. Um, I've spent my whole life as an editor. They're a loathsome breed. They're credit stealers, weirdos, not anyway. Yeah, there was an edit. It was the most substantive edit, and I'm really grateful for it actually, because when you begin to write, I mean, when you've immersed yourself in a story and the story begins to emerge in your brain pan, and then you begin to assess the story, the shape of it that's emerging against the material that you've got or that you're getting. Then its shape begins to sort of it takes shape in your mind. That doesn't mean that you're always going to get it right when you sit down to write. I didn't in this case. The beginning of the story is I don't know if you've read it, but it doesn't matter. We begin on the last Sunday of Bubba Copeland's life. It's the last Sunday service of his life. It happens to be Pastor Appreciation Day at the church, and it's just a celebration of him. It's the expression of love, and they have strawberry cake. It's his favorite, and a lot of music in his honor. And that passage had been deeper in the first section. And my editor, very wisely, we began to have a Talmudic discussion about that too. And he said, I really think that this is where the piece starts. I said, of course you're right. But I had begun it. This is just sort of as you're searching out your material, and you'll do this you'll discover it on page, right? And edit as you go. But I had begun it essayistically. I had begun it the way that the second section now starts, which is we all have things that we don't want people to know about us. And that's a valid lead, but not nearly as interesting as the scene. And I had it. It was already, I just kind of harvested it, and Masat wrote it in. And of course, it's the only scene. Because he gives this speech that day. And shame on me, I hadn't watched the service before I went down to Alabama. I watched it immediately when I got back, in which he makes the distinction between being Christian and being Christ-like. And he says, 3 days before being outed by a malign journalistic organ, that some Christians hurt people. So, I mean, it kind of gave me chills. So, of course, that's the lead.
Before you sit down to write, do you have a blueprint for the structure in your mind, or?
I mean, I really outline. I do rough, broad outlines about the story elements and the order of them. I do think, and I'm sure I'll find 100 arguments in here against this, but I don't think that there are variable orders to a story. I think that every story has its essential order, and it's a puzzle, and we just have to figure it out. We have to figure out the puzzle, because there's an optimal way to organize your material to take best advantage of the dramatic potential of the material. It's in sort of your obligation based on a bedrock of reporting, make sure you get everything right. But based on that bedrock, you're obliged to create. And so, and to figure out, what to, what to reveal and what not to reveal, and when, and the pacing of the reveal, the pitch and pace of the story, the build of the tension of the story. And so to me, that there's an essential order. I've gotten that through just a long time of trial and error on a lot of stories, some mine, a lot of other people's stories. And it's a wonderful part of the work, I think, because this is going to be published once, it's going to be published forever. You may as well try. And I think that it also, in doing justice to the subjects of the story, it's you're sort of obliged to suffer it that way.
Last question, then we're going to open it up for questions. You said something the other day that every story has a different line. How do you know where that line is? Every story has a different line, and we were talking about crossing lines.
Oh, oh gosh, yeah.
Yeah.
You mean in terms of the lines between subject and author, that sort of thing? Or?
And being a human and being a journalist, and you hugged Carter at the end of that, and you're still in touch, and that's the real relationships.
Yeah, I mean,
out of stories like this.
I don't think you set out to do that. I wouldn't advise it, but it also just happens because, I mean, I go into stories kind of with the predication that we're all broken. We're all just trying to get through a day, especially when you are approaching a story like this in which the brokenness is evident on their faces and in what they're telling you. And so, I mean, I think that there are bright lines that exist between journalist and subject for a very, very, very good reason. But they typically, and I think that you can also be trusted as a journalist to use your judgment about when to really strictly observe those lines and when a human response is warranted.
Do you want to tell them about Stephanie?
Yeah, I went to, you would ask. I went to,
I'm a journalist.
I went to Mississippi. I went to Mississippi a few days after Katrina hit, and I fell in and to do a story with Tom Junot about the families of these two soldiers who had been killed that year, 2 months before, and then had their towns completely skinned by the hurricane. Like, Jesus Christ, how much can these families lose? And very, very long story short, that was 2005. In 2013, Stephanie Lee, the subject of the story, wrote to me on Facebook. Again, it's good for something, saying that she had found out that day she had cancer and would I pray for her? And then we wrote back and forth for a time, and then we began to talk. And then, very, very long story short, Tom Junot and I became her caregivers because all she had was she was a war widow. Her husband had been killed. She had the only thing available to her was military health care. So that meant that her oncologist had 500 patients, probably not most attentive. And so we decided we wanted to try to get her the health care that people who aren't war widows living in poverty in South Mississippi get. So we did that. Crossed every line, violated every rule. But those rules apply. The rules are meant to protect the integrity of your journalism. When you're dealing with, a wide array of subjects, generally with some sort of power, or to avoid a conflict of interest. But what happens when someone who's dying of cancer, or the son of a subject who committed suicide is weeping before you, a suffering human being? Is there anything wrong with having a human response? I think probably some people would argue, yeah. I don't care. I made other choices. I take those rules very seriously, and I think that every journalist should use their very best judgment and to have those rules in mind all the while. But we're human beings, and we're asking them to expose themselves in their greatest vulnerability. So Jesus Christ, we can't be all business about this shit. It seems to me.
Thank you. Would like to open for questions. And I agree. I've I've told my students, I think, I would rather be a human first and a journalist second. And if y'all want to take my journalism card away for that, I'm good with that.
I actually learned that from you, so thank you. And I think I called you from Mexico City once, crying, going, "How do I go about this?" So, thank you. So, thank you so much, and congratulations. This story, I cry from time to time. This made me cry. I was wondering how the fact checking, how did that work for you? Because it's you basically were speaking here with people who didn't really trust the press at all when you arrived. You build trust. I'm sure you explained to them what was going to happen after. Esquire is not going to publish it if we can't fact check it. But did they trust just you, or did they trust the people who would come after?
That's a very good question. They were very reassured, actually, that we were going to be scrupulous about every sentence in the piece, because by contrast, when the 1819 News first story had broken, Carter Copeland had written to the correspondent who wrote the story, begging to talk to him, asking to talk to him. Please, he was angry, but he also said, I want to tell you who my father really is. And Carter Copeland is still waiting for a return call. So they weren't, so the subjects of this story were really kind of reassured that we wanted to ask them to do something that was really hard, not just talk to me, but then have someone, and even a stranger, someone that they didn't even know a little, who wanted to go through the details of the story with them again. And then we also, in the section of the story in which I kind of profile the 1819 News and the founder of 1819 News, who never returned my calls. First of all, as it was the first time in like 37 years in journalism where another journalist didn't call me back, even to say, sorry, I'm not going to talk to you. It's just you have to return a call from another journalist, which just kind of confirmed to me what they were in the business of. It wasn't journalism. It was agenda driven. They had this man's life in their hands and they didn't care. But our lawyers were particularly interested in that section.
And just a follow-up question, is there any, when you do your reporting on such subjects, and I know this is a very unique story, are there any things that, for instance, you will take a photo of something you will use in your story, you'll take a photo or anything, is there anything that you find difficult to fact check? Not something that someone said, but maybe a detail like, oh, I remember it was actually raining, but I just have no way of proving it. Sorry, you can actually use the Weather Channel for that. Like any detail that you sometimes may find difficult to prove that it happened while you were there.
It's funny. I gotta say,
like an impression, something. How do you even prove it?
well, I mean, I do think that it's our business. It's really kind of incumbent upon us, because memory is strange, and if there are 5 witnesses to something, you have 5 pretty different accounts of a set of facts that, I mean, there must be some objective truth somewhere. But so it's incumbent upon us to reconcile accounts that are sometimes in disagreement and figure out why they're in disagreement and whether it's a flaw in someone's memory. If it's maybe, oh, it's something that they weren't in the room for after all, that instant, that exchange, or it's something they heard secondhand. And you have to kind of do a bit of, that's just a part of the reporting. You just have to kind of track the truth to ground as much as possible. Nothing specific comes to mind in terms of a detail or an impression like that for this story. Once they gave me the privilege of talking to me, they were determined that I knew everything as completely as I could know it from their perspective. So,
Thank you so much.
sure.
I'm not 100% sure how to word this question, so I'm just going to try my best. But when I first read your story, it was really difficult for me to read because
Yeah.
there's so much shame in this story. And I think is part of what led him ultimately to kill himself.
Yeah.
And when I read it again, it was easier for me to see the difference between like you trying to represent how the people around him viewed him and what he did versus you as the journalist like agreeing to that perspective. Or like for example, there was like one phrase you call his like transgressions. And I guess I was just curious, and I know the whole point of the story was to rewrite a narrative about that was just incorrect. But I'm really curious, like if you thought about or like the conversations that you had about how this played into the larger way that, and not to say that he identifies in any of these ways, but like gender or like trans or just like people are represented in the media these days. Like,
Yeah.
how did you try to write about him and the real like negative reaction some people had without like in
Yeah.
yeah.
No. I mean, no, that's a really good question. It's a really important question because you have to calibrate what matters most in the story and calibrate how much space to give something, both psychically and on the page. And in death, after he died, there were people, especially from 1819 News, who compounded their slander of him because it wasn't just, Baptist preacher, hypocrite, crossdresser, ha ha, anymore. Their story had grave consequences. So they had to make up things about him. They had to imagine a dark, hidden, as yet to be exposed a secret, an even deeper, darker, more injurious secret. And to me, that was so ugly and so terrifying. And also a testament to the technology that you can do these things and have a lot of people believe you because they want to believe you, because it comports with their worldview. And as journalists, we're just kind of stuck, kind of in this swirl, having to figure out where the truth is. And so when they were taking these pieces of bad judgment from Copeland, of things that he had done meant to be in private, and turning them into making him into a demented, perverted, dangerous person that it was their duty to expose. Then I had to figure out if that was real or not, and as much as I possibly could. And so, that meant reaching out to the people whose pictures and names he had used in his posts that were never meant to be seen by anybody except for about 100 people in a Reddit subgroup all over the world. So I also kind of wrapped myself around the axle for a few days, trying to figure out whether and to what extent gender issues did play in the story. The primary source to really understand that was no longer living. And I didn't want to freelance. I didn't want to guess. I wanted to honor the way he was known publicly, the way he wanted to be known publicly. And in his intimate group of friends, including his son, they don't know what this was with Baba. His son takes his word for it. His ex-wife believes that this is not in the story, but this is just part of the reporting, that if this had been available to Baba when he was younger, that he would have transitioned. But I didn't know any of that and couldn't prove any of that. This is just what people felt. And I don't know if that's really far afield from what you were asking, but these are issues that I had to kind of reckon with. Does that make sense? Okay.
Hello.
Last question.
So I wanted to ask you a little bit about building trust in the community. And, when you were initially envisioning the story, because at least in my own experiences working in rural communities, the idea of just showing up and being present is, can make or break a story. And, and I was curious if what your initial conversations were like when it came to how far you were willing to, go to, be present in the community in order to, get people to open up, whether it was, renting, an Airbnb and door knocking, because, it seems like there's a fine line between being earnest and wanting to do a story and perhaps being, overeager to the point of, being, an obnoxious reporter, because I've certainly been on that end of things.
Yeah. I mean, I didn't think about the challenge for this story was focusing the story and figuring out what the story was and who were the sources who could help me tell the story. Who were the main characters in the story? Who had a purchase on the story and had a standing to be talking about what happened. So, I mean, I thought about, and I think one of your students who first read the story was like, why didn't he talk to more people in the church? And that's a fair question. But that ultimately is not what the story was. It was not a social anthropology of the First Baptist Church of Phoenix City. It was a story about his community there and what he left behind and the values he had inculcated them with. And but I do think that for a story like this, there's a way to do this story, perfectly responsibly reported, written with a bit of distance, journalist protecting himself, not getting too involved. And that would have been fine, but it would have been, in my view, kind of dry as dust and wouldn't have delivered either the experience of the reporting or the experience that these people had gone through. I mean, you could split the atom with the pain and grief and emotion in this town. And so it felt incumbent upon me to try to convey that. And as Maria said earlier today, whenever you're dealing with massive emotions, you've got to be kind of bracing in your clarity and use very plain and simple language and get the hell out of the way. This is a tidal wave of emotion. And so, but I think it's important to sort of, if we want readers to be affected by things, to really kind of maximally affected, to kind of deliver that experience for them, then we first have to feel things, I think. We first have to experience that. And it's funny, I will say this one last thing that we were talking about Stephanie. When my wife took me to the airport, dropping me off at LaGuardia to fly to Atlanta to drive to Phoenix City, kissed her goodbye, and she said, "Please don't adopt another family." So then imagine my surprise when I had to explain to her that I'd adopted kind of a whole town.